Okay, good evening, everyone. Wonderful to have the opportunity to do a little learning with you this evening. Last time we met, we spoke about a big topic, the topic of what it means when biblical heroes make missteps or commit errors or even commit sins. So when we last left Abraham and his entourage, he was being not so politely escorted out of Egypt for having been found guilty of being responsible for a plague that came upon Pharaoh's house. But the consequence of that is that Abraham was even wealthier now than he was when he left Egypt the first than when he went to Egypt the first time around. So he was a wealthy man when we first met him, and now he's grown even wealthier. Okay, so I want to pick up at the beginning of chapter 13 and focus this evening in tonight's class on a dispute between Abraham and Lot, and I want to tease out from that dispute another major theme in the life of Abraham, and I actually want to widen the lens and think about how it fits into some of the broader themes of Bereshis. Okay, so if you have this source sheet in front of you, we're just going to quickly look at the kind of principal text. I'll make some trouble as I usually do. See if we can formulate a few questions and then look at the material together. So I'll put up the source on the screen. Hopefully everyone can see it. Here is Perek Yud Gimel. Vayal Avram mimitzrayim hu v'yishto v'chol asher lo v'lo timo hanegba. So if you're moving up from Egypt and coming back to the land of Canaan, so you end up in the Negev, you end up in the south. So Abraham and his wife and Lot and their everyone who's with them, so they end up in the Negev. And as we just mentioned, Abraham kaved me'od. There's something of a literary irony here. When Abraham had to go down to Egypt, and again, that has a kind of double entendre. When we talk about going down to Egypt or coming up to Israel, so it's geographic, but it's also spiritual, which is always why we say if somebody moves to Israel, they make aliyah. So, maybe from a topographical standpoint, it's a little higher, but spiritually, right, it's an elevated place. So when Abraham had gone down to Egypt, what precipitated the move? What precipitated the move was a ra'av, which was described as being kaved. There was a famine in the land, and it was, we translate in English, severe, but kaved literally means heavy, right? It was untenable for Abraham to remain there. And here that word shows up again. Abraham's returning to the land, and now what's kaved? Right, kaved means there wasn't enough, and now there's overmuch. Right, so there's a turnabout here, and now Abraham returns, and he's the one who's heavy, he's laden down, burdened, one would even say, with all the wealth that he's accumulated, the cattle and the silver and the gold. Vayelech lamasav. I want to flag that expression. Okay, he went on his way, he went on his journeys, he's traveling. What would we expect, right? We know that he's in motion. So what is the force of this seemingly extraneous expression? Vayelech lamasav, he went on his journeys. He goes on his journeys, minegev v'ad beis el ad hamakom asher yasham lo batchila bein beis el uvein ha'ai. Okay, so I didn't put a map on the source sheet, even though we could have. But this piece we can imagine because we know the geography of Israel. So if you go north, when you're in the Negev and you head toward Jerusalem, let's just say Beit El is Jerusalem. So that's where he ended up, and that's where he had begun between Beit El and Ai. So he goes back to the original Mizbeach, which he had built, and he calls out B'Shem Hashem, and I'll just flag it, right? So we always translate it, he called out, he made a Mizbeach, we sort of pretend to know what that means, but what really does that mean? What does it mean that he made a Mizbeach and he called out with God's name? Now, here's the crux of the story. Avram wasn't the only one who had accumulated great wealth. Lot was also very wealthy. The land was, right? We would say if this were an Old West movie, right? It ain't big enough for the both of us. So the land was incapable of bearing the two of them. They could not dwell there together. Right? Same formulation. Again, right? Their wealth is so great that they can't dwell together. So right away, by the way, we understand the value that the Torah is placing on togetherness, and we'll circle back to this in a few minutes. But what the Torah is telling us is the fantasy is, the hope is, the aspiration is that they could have dwelled together for reasons which we'll come to. That's not possible. Okay, but at least it tells us what the value is, what we had hoped would have happened. They can't dwell together. And a fight breaks out. A reeve often means even something physical, right? So there's some ambiguity in the text. Like we say in English, there was a conflict between two people. That might be a physical conflict. It might be a verbal conflict. It might be an emotional conflict. It's a reeve, okay? So there's some kind of strife. There's some kind of conflict, which we'll have to explore between the shepherds of Avram and the shepherds of Lot. And and the Canaanites and the Perizzites were in the land. So I always make the same joke when I read this pasuk. So first of all, it's a total non sequitur, right? So what does the first half of the verse have to do with the second? There's a fight between the shepherds, the Canaanites, and the Perizzites are in the land. So that's the first point. What's the connection? And the joke I always make is, it's like saying, I traveled on a trip and I went to Canada, and guess who I found in Canada? Canadians. This is Canaan. Who do I expect to find in Canaan? The Canaanites. And it happens to be, right, it's the land of 7 nations. So the Perizzites also live in Canaan. So they're in Canaan. Obviously they're in Canaan. Why should that surprise us at all? So Avram right away says, I don't want it. I don't want there to be conflict between us. I don't want there to be conflict between our shepherds. Ki anashim achim anachim. Okay, I want to flag this as well. How do you translate anashim achim anachim? Okay, so they translated here, I actually like this translation, for we are brethren. Okay. A lot of times, if anybody has a different chumash and you want to just call out what your translation says, a lot of times it'll be translated as relatives, right? Because they're not brothers, right? What's the relationship between Avram and Lot? It's nephew and uncle and nephew. So if you want to preserve the kind of genuine relationship between them, so maybe you translate this as we are relatives. But achim literally means brothers. So, brethren, I like that translation because it preserves the literalness of the word, but at the same time, we say achenu, Beis Yisrael, our brethren in Israel, so relatives. So it might mean one or it might mean both. So Avram says, I don't want there to be a fight. We're relatives, we're brothers. Hello, kol haaretz lefanecha. We got the whole land here, right? Hipared nami alai. Separate from me. Im hasmol ve'amina b'im hayamin ba'asma'ila. You go left, I'll go right. You go right, I'll go left. Whatever you want. Vayisalot es einav vayaris kol kikar yarden ki kula mashke lifnei shaches Hashem es Sodom ve'es Amorah kegan Hashem keretz Mitzrayim bo achad zoar. This is a packed pasuk. Okay, and the Torah actually does something here that it does almost never, okay, which is that it retrojects, right? It takes something that has not yet happened and it retrojects it back into our narrative. So when you say Sodom, right, so right away you think of that wicked city which was destroyed. So the Torah knows that's our first association, and the Torah says the stone that we're talking about here is a stone before all of that stuff happened. Okay. So Lot lifts up his eyes and he sees this beautiful kikar. Okay, there's this plain and it's fertile. And again, this is the interpolation, right? Like in brackets, the footnote. And by the way, we're talking about the Sodom, lifnei shaches Hashem es Sodom Ezra. Okay, kigan Hashem keretz Mitzrayim bo achad zoar. It was beautiful and it was so lush. just like Egypt. What's the reference to Egypt? So the reference to Egypt is it's the same ecology as the Nile Delta, which is to say, you have the bonus of fertile land just by dint of living next to a body of water which overflows. And if you're a shepherd, it's heaven on earth, right? Which is basically the formulation of this pasuk, Kigan Hashem, like couldn't be better, because you never have to worry that you're going to run out of pasture lands. It's just fertile as far as the eye could see. Okay. So Lot sees this and he says, that's my prize. Vayibchar lo Lot es kol kikar Yarden, vayisa Lot mikedem, v'yeperdu ish mi'al achiv. Lot heads to Sodom and they separate. Abraham yashav be'eretz Canaan. And in case you missed it, like a recap, so now that Lot is out of the picture, so Abraham is dwelling in Canaan. The Lot yoshav ba'arei kikar v'yahal ad Sodom, and Lot is dwelling in Sodom. There's quite a lot of scholarly debate. You think we could have settled this already, but there's a lot of debate as to where Sodom is exactly. So we kind of know that, it's somewhere in the Dead Sea region. Is it in the north? Is it in the south? Somehow we have a sense that it's near the Dead Sea. Exactly where is something of an open question. Okay, so let me just do a quick recap of some of the questions that I want to explore with you. One is Vayelech l'masa'av, this pasuk in this formulation in pasuk Gimel that Avram went on his travels. What does that mean? Isn't he always in motion? Isn't he always traveling? Second question. So really, the key to understanding this whole episode is to really understand what's behind this conflict between Abraham's shepherds and Lot's shepherds. It's so banal. The Torah is a short book. So you're giving me a whole chapter about a fight between shepherds? Like, really? Let's hear something about ethical monotheism. Let's hear something about Abraham's chesed and tzedek and mishpat. What are we talking about? Shepherds and their pasture lands. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, what are they doing? And who cares? It's so out of left field. Why do they matter? It's going to be a clue. We just have to figure out what it clues us into. And then, zooming out, as I said at the beginning, so there's a message here. There's a message here about Abraham and how Abraham fits into the larger narrative and the larger narrative arc of Sefer Bereshis. And I want to see if we can tease it out together. So let me pause here and just ask if there are any questions, comments, or attempts to answer any of the questions that I've raised, anything that anyone would like to volunteer. Okay, so in that case, let me take it from the top. Everyone's muted, but you should feel free at any point to unmute yourself if the spirit moves you. Okay, so let me share with you a comment of the Malbim and a comment of the Netziv. I'll put it up on the screen, and I think it's actually helpful to understand something which we've touched on over the past few courses, but haven't zoomed in on specifically. Okay, so if you look at sources, sources 1 and 2 on your sheets. So the Malbim writes the following. So he says, "V'yelech l'masa'av rotze lomer shetachlis halichaso lo haya lishgon b'makom yuchad rak linso mimakom lamakom lasof anshe hamakom v'lidrosh lipnehem yichud Hashem upnos ha'emunah." So we talked about this a little when we looked at the first part of Lech Lecha. And we mentioned a medrash that says Lech Lecha is really an indication that Abraham is not just going on one trip, like the defining trip of his life that starts his prophetic career because he moves from Haran to Canaan. But Lech Lecha means that this man is always in motion, peripatetic. He's constantly journeying. right? And this is why I think I may have mentioned this in the past. You stop a grade school kid and say, can you just tell me, I want to give you a prize. If you answer the following question correctly, just tell me, where did Abraham live? Right? And you'll get 50 different answers. Oh, he lived in Haran, and he lived in Canaan, and he lived in Beersheba, and he lived in Hebron, and he took a trip to Mitzrayim. He's everywhere. He's in Beit El, and he's in Ai, and he's in Haram. He's all over the map, right? So the Malbim says, Vayelech l'masa'av means he returned to his mission. And I use that word very specifically because that's the word we have in English. We say someone is a missionary. It has a little bit of a uncomfortable connotation, like they're trying to sell you something. But a missionary means someone who is traveling about because they are on a mission. And that's what the Malbim says. That's what it means. Abraham was on a mission to spread the gospel, forgive the anachronism, of ethical monotheism. So the goal wasn't, right, and remember with this medrash from a couple weeks ago, this perfume, it's like, he has a perfume in a basement and nobody could have access to it. So you take the show on the road and now everyone can benefit from the beautiful smell of this perfume. So he has a message to tell, he has a message to communicate to the world. And it's not sufficient if he pitches his shingle in one particular locale and has conversations with 8 of the locals. So that's beautiful. But what about everyone else in the region? So he goes from place to place, pitching his tent, traveling hither and yon to preach the message of ethical monotheism. And this is what the Netziv says in the next source. It's really the definition of what the pasuk says. He went back to the mizbeach, vayikra sham Abraham b'shem Hashem. So you know what it means to call out b'shem Hashem? This is what it means. So it's not like he got to the mizbeach and he said, Baruch Hashem. No, he got to the mizbeach and he held a press conference, right? And he started to explain to people what it means that he's worshiping a monotheistic deity. And people would ask questions and he would give answers and he would sermonize and he'd give lectures and he'd teach and he'd invite people for Friday night dinner and he would bring them into the tent of Avraham and Sarah under the Kanfei Hashchina, right? This is his mission. This is what it means that he called out B'Shem Hashem. Okay, so that's the introduction to the person that gets into this conflict with Lot. Okay, so on the one hand, and we're going to talk about this more next time, in case you are distracted by the fact that Abraham has had to be in a position of moral compromise, right? In case you're distracted by the fact that, Abraham is the contemporary Elon Musk, right? He's the biggest billionaire in the region. In case you think that the focus is there, no. Just know that for Avraham Avinu, he's on his mission, he's on his journey, he is continuing to perform the mission that he began with, namely to call out B'Shem Hashem and to preach ethical monotheism. It's against this backdrop that we can understand where Lot is coming from and the dispute that Lot and his shepherds have with Abraham and his. So I want to study with you a Rashi, which we probably all learned when we were much younger. And it's actually a very complicated and very profound Rashi that sometimes perhaps we learn too quickly. So I want to study it with you for a moment. Okay, it's deceptively simple. What's the Rashi? So Rashi writes the following: Vahi Riv. There's a fight. So what are the shepherds fighting about? These shepherds of Abraham and these shepherds of Lot. So Rashi says Lefish is going to ring a bell, right? Everyone knows this Rashi. Lefish hayu roin shalot rishayim mariim behemtam bistos acheret. It's because there was a fight because the shepherds of Lot were wicked people, and they used to allow their cattle to graze in the fields of other people, which is illicit. You're not allowed to do that, right? If I have a field, that's my grass, and you can't use it, and it's a scarce resource. And unless you make a deal with me or buy the rights to use it, that's illegal. And the righteous shepherds of Abraham would chastise the shepherds of Lot, and they'd say, that's theft. You're not allowed to do that. V'lo ein yoresh, v'lot yorsho, v'ein ze gezel, v'kasuv omer v'aknani v'haprisi az yorshe b'aretz v'lo zacha ba'Abraham batay. So the shepherds of Lot, right, are Talmudists, and they say, no, you're accusing us of theft. You're accusing us of larceny. This is nothing of the kind. You know, as well as we know, that God promised the land to Abraham. Abraham, you and I know, has been married for a long time and is quite elderly, and he has no child, and he has no heir. The only heir is Lot, his nephew. He's the closest relative in the next generation. Ve'ein ze gezel. So this is not larceny. So everything we're doing, right? We're just playing out the prophecy that everyone knows. This land is Avram's, which is a different way of saying the land is Lot's, because he's the Yoresh, he's the heir, the only heir. So then Rashi says this, right, brilliant and elegant solution to the riddle that we posed a few moments ago. Why is the pasuk telling us V'aktani v'haprizi az yoshev baretz? What's the relevance of the fact that the Canaanites and the Perizzites are in the land? So Rashi says, no, that's the point. That's the answer. That's the answer to Lot's Talmudic argument. The land belongs to us. It's promised to Abraham. Abraham has no heir. Lot's the heir. It's ours. The pasuk says no. Hasn't happened yet. Who's dwelling in the land? The land belongs to these local tribes of the Canaanites and the Perizzites, because everything you just described is a prophecy which has not yet unfolded. In which case, the shepherds of Abraham say, what you're doing is in fact theft. You're stealing from the Canaanites and the Perizzites. The land belongs to them. Okay. So I'm going to pick up on this in a minute and share something about Lot and his disposition. So just hold on to it, because this is what I would say is the first theory about how to understand the dispute and what it tells us about the nature of Lot and his shepherds. But before I do that, in the interest of intellectual honesty, I just want to share with you a couple of other paths toward interpreting the relevance of the Canaanites and the Perizzites here, because I think they are fascinating. Okay. So the first is predicated on an old midrashic school of thought, which you have in the next source. I'll just read it, or if you have the source sheet, you're welcome to follow along. The Medrash says, what are the Canaanites and Perizzites doing here? Shayu az yoshvim shalvim ushkatim, below shum sichsuch alehem. So the Medrash says, you know what the Torah is doing? The Torah is pointing out that the Canaanites and the Perizzites are living peacefully and harmoniously together, without any sichsuch, without any broigus between them. Everyone is getting along so beautifully. The Alshich in the next source, right, amplifying this medrash, he says, in biblical Hebrew, so you have to match the noun and the predicate. Okay, so if you're a plural noun, so it has to be matched to a plural verb. Okay. So if you're talking about Canaanites and Perizzites, it should be v'aknani v'haprisi as yoshvim ba'aretz. In the plural, they are dwelling in the land. Yoshev is the singular. So the Alshich says it's a hint, it's a clue that they were getting along so beautifully and so famously that they were considered to be a singular unit such that they could be described with a singular verb. And toward the end of your source sheets, there's a comment of the Drashos Ri Ibn Shu'ib, which is like a 12th century Spanish exegete, and he says based on a Yerushalmi. So he says, people are always making comparisons. So the message was that Abraham was trying to convey was, just look around. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, these pagans, these tribal clans, they are descended from different places and different tribes, and they're getting along so nicely. And you and I, right? We're family. Lo, you and I, and we can't even get along. What are the other nations going to say about us? So the relevance of the Canaanites and the Perizzites is that their harmoniousness throws into stark relief the degree to which it's such a busha. What an embarrassment that, we're just, how many members of the faith are there? Right? It's like the old joke, so 2 Jews and 3 shuls, like, that's it. We're a small people. It's Avram and Sarah and Lot, and they can't do it. They can't even get along. The Canaanites and the Perizzites, for crying out loud, they're getting along. We can't even get along, right? So the relevance of this of these other nations is, again, to highlight the absurdity of the fact that that Abraham and Lot and their respective businesses can't manage to get along. Okay, so close parentheses, and I want to circle back now to one of the principal arguments that I want to share with you, and the primary source that I want to study with you is 2 comments actually by Rabbi Samson Raphael Hirsch, and I'll put it up on the screen. Now, he didn't write these words in English, right? He wrote his commentary in German, but I'm sorry, that is not the right page. But the translation captures. What it is that I want to share with you. All right, let's see if we can get this. So here is the comment of Rav Hirsch. So it just requires one word of introduction. If you go back to Pasuk Hey, and I'll pull it up on the source sheet. Go back to Pasuk Hey. So in the Torah itself, there are no nekudot. There's no punctuation. There's no vowelization. But we have what we call the trup, which are the notes that tell us how the psukim are chanted. Okay. So at the end of a pasuk, you have something called the sof pasuk, and that's the equivalent of a period. And at the end of a clause, you have something that's called an asnachta, looks like an upside down wishbone, and that tells you, like, semicolon, comma. It's the end of a thought. Okay. And you hear it when the Balkare reads it, to pause. So this is actually punctuated in source number 5, even though I don't have the trup in front of you. So this matches the trup. Under the word Avram is an esnachta, which tells you that the pasuk is divided after the word Avram. V'gam lelot haolech es Avraham, comma. Right? And Lot was also with Abraham, Hayat son ubakar ve'olim. And he too had son ubakar ve'olim. He also had all of these tents and flocks and so on. So listen to the words of Rav Hirsch. He picks up on this a very subtle point. He says, on the word Abraham, there's an esnachta. Okay, there's a semicolon. Lot also had. Before the object to the verb is mentioned, it makes us pause a moment to think what we should have expected from a relative who not only lived in, but es Abraham, intimately with Abraham. So I think it's actually a brilliant thought exercise. Go back to Pasuk Hey. So the pasuk v'gam Lot halech es Avraham. You know what Lot, who was Abraham's companion, had? Pause. Pregnant pause. The first says, you know what I think the pasuk should say? What I expected to say. Intimately sharing life with Abraham, who in his isolation, still by his hospitality, drew strangers, who only came into contact with him en passant, into a knowledge of him who makes people hospitable and benevolent, and raises them from selfish greed to the aspiration to be like unto him and to be a source of blessing, liyos bracha, rather than to obtain blessing. Now, here it says, Lot too, who had lived so closely with Abraham, had had something from it, had obtained something from Abraham. But what? What I think it's going to say. He had chesed, tzedakah, mishpat, hachnasas orchim, avas Hashem. What did he have? What did Lot gain from his, years-long relationship with traveling with Abraham and experiencing life with Abraham? You know what he picked up? Sheep and cattle and tents. It's unbelievable. Not a word of the spiritual calling. He accompanied because he profited materially by it. And tents, v'ohalim, the complete floor, right? Not ahalim. He ceased being a member of Abraham's household, had his own independent circle in which he was master of the house, whereas Abraham's was the tent of Sarah, ahalo. The management of the house was given over to her, and Abraham considered it his business, likro b'shem Hashem. So the tent, right? Achnasas orchim, everything goes on in the tent. Sarah, calling out b'shem Hashem, Abraham. Lot had very different ideas. He considered his business to be the acquirement of sheep and cattle and had no feeling for Abraham's spiritual mission. This is the meaning of the accent and stress laid on the word Abraham in this verse, and this explains all what follows. Okay, Lot, as we began to talk about, is the literary foil for Abraham. They have the same experiences. They go through the same trials and tribulations. Lot also has to deal with the famine. Lot also has to deal with Paro. Lot also has to deal with the burden of wealth. So which way are you going to go? What's your decision? What's your direction? What's your orientation? What's your choice? It's the same path, except that Abraham's path leads him likro b'shem Hashem, to call out and to teach ethical monotheism. And you could live the same life as Abraham and reach a conclusion that the goal is to amass cattle and flocks and tents. So listen to what Rav Hirsch says next. He says, the land was not able to bear them remaining together. Okay, why? Because they had too many herds and flocks and there was not enough pasturage for them? Come on, not so. Were the whole one herd, one concern, it would have been sufficient. It was insufficient, we are told, ki haya rechusham rav, because their other property, kesef, azav, etc., was too great. Because if one is not united, if one does not trust the other, then ohalim are necessary, chests and safe and everything separate. Because their property, their fortune was too great, they no longer fitted together, could no longer dwell together. Therefore, they could no longer remain on the same soil. Because in Lot's affairs, one cared only and solely for profit, but in Abraham's other higher interests also came into consideration because the use to which that which had been acquired was put was different. I'm not interested in wealth for wealth's sake. I'm interested in wealth because it allows me to perform my godly mission in this world more easily. It's just in the use which is made of one's fortune, that above all, one man differs from another. That was why they could not remain together. That was why the land was not large enough to contain the two of them. Lot had to have his own separate pasturages so that not one tiny lamb from the flock should lose itself in the other. So I find Rav Hirsch's explanation quite convincing and quite compelling. It's like the Seirim on Yom Kippur. They're twins. The goats are exactly the same, but one Seir is La Hashem and one Seir is La Azazel. everything about them, their whole milieu, they're coming from the same place, they have the same experiences, they have the same flocks, and yet they reach entirely different conclusions. And it's here that Abraham makes his his offer, and says to Lot, I think it's time. I think it's time we part ways. The Netziv, and again, I'll just kind of paraphrase in the next source, makes a very astute observation. So, who's the senior partner and who's the junior partner? So Abraham is clearly the senior partner. The fact that Lot has all this wealth is a direct function of his association with Abraham. So just imagine this scene. So the senior person comes to the junior person and says, and you could sort of map this onto like, social etiquette with a host and a guest. And the senior says, which would you prefer? It's really up to you. So the junior person, right, the socially normal thing would be to say, thank you so much for offering. You decide, you pick, right? And whatever's left for me, I'm so grateful. That would be the normal thing to do. That would be the socially appropriate thing to say, except Lot doesn't do anything of the kind. Abraham offers Lot, whichever you prefer, and Lot says, "Okay, thanks. I'll take the nicer half, but you take the leftovers." It's unbelievable. Right? The Netziv goes even further. He says, "Right, you know what Abraham offered? He offered to split the difference. Right? He said, if you want to go, we need to, let's just say, to quantify it, we need to be 5 miles apart." So Abraham says, I'll split it with you. You can go 2.5 miles in one direction. I'll go 2.5 in the other, right? Which is, he's willing to absorb the effort and the cost and the time of moving his own camp, right, to accommodate Lot. Now, it doesn't end up happening because Lot is so attached to material gain that he takes the high road directly to Sodom, and of course, right, it's all a moral critique that the pasuk is already indicating to us. It hasn't been destroyed yet, but we know it will be. And why will it be? Because it's the seat of, right, sin and perversion and greed and everything that we associate with Sodom, clear as day. And yet that's exactly the thing to which Lot is attracted. So I want to start to wrap up with two final thoughts, and then I'll open it up to any questions or discussion. So the first is a kind of footnote, okay, and it's a comment from the Alshif, which is, I think, the last source on your sheet. And he says, he's a Kabbalist, and he has a kind of Kabbalistic reading of this section. And he says that the word riv can sometimes become a meriva. Riv is the feminine, riv is the masculine, and meriva is the feminine. And he says the whole section, it remains in the shorter form, in the masculine form, as a riv as opposed to a meriva. And he says it's a kind of metaphor in the sense that before it became the nekeva, before it gave birth, right, before it expanded into something much bigger, Abraham was so savvy that he wanted to nip it in the bud. Because he says, this is the nature. This is the nature of conflict, right? How often, right? Whether we've been in it ourselves or we know because we're one step removed, there's a family conflict. And what started it? Right? Half the time we can't even remember. But if we can remember, the thing that started it was like, they gave me the wrong kibbud at the bar mitzvah. Like, really? Right? That's what started it. They didn't offer to pay for the cab. who cares, right? No, but people, right? It goes back thousands of years, right? You can only blame people so much. It's built in to, the way family dynamics work, which is we get so worked up about something and it starts to spiral and it starts to build. The Riv becomes a Meriva. It's so beautiful. If you have a minute to look in the Alshech. So he says this was, right, part of the genius of Abraham to say, I got it, right? Avraham and Lot aren't even fighting. It's secondarily, the shepherds are starting to fight. He says, I don't want it. I don't want it to blow up and become a source of conflict for us. So just nip it in the bud, and before it happens, cut it off at the pass and don't allow it to escalate into something bigger than it ought to be. It's nothing. It's pasture land. We have a solution. We can get by with this solution and let it not stand between us. At the end of the day, we're relatives. At the end of the day, we're brothers. And this is the point with which I want to conclude. Think of the narrative arc of Sefer Bereshis. There's sibling rivalry and conflict between and among families in virtually every generation that we come to. Sometimes we focus on it a little more, sometimes we focus on it a little less, right? Starting with Cain and Hevel and moving right on down through the generations, Yitzchak and Yishmael, Yaakov and Esav, Yosef and his brothers. There's not a lot of good models for how to manage these family conflicts and these sibling rivalries. And what I want to offer is one observation with which to conclude, and that is the point where we began with this story of Achim. So go back to the family tree in your minds. Abraham is one of three brothers. He has a brother Nahor, and we hear about him because it's his descendants who become the brides of Abraham's descendants, right? Rivka, Rachel, Leah. So they are descended directly from Nahor, Abraham's brother. And Abraham has another brother, Haran, who has died. Okay. Abraham's brother Haran had one son, and the son's name is Lot. And so Lot is the proxy. Lot is the stand-in, right? He has this dual identity. On the one hand, he's the fill-in for the son that Abraham doesn't have, right? And that kind of gives birth to this narrative that Rashi, makes famous, the sense of Lot being the ersatz heir to Abraham, because Abraham has no biological heir because he has no children, right? So on one level, right, he's the proxy for the son Abraham doesn't have. But on another level, and this is the level I want to highlight here, Lot is the proxy for the brother that Abraham doesn't have because the brother's dead. So what we're really seeing here, and the Medrash even says this, the Medrash says, the son of your brother is like your brother, your nephew is like your brother, especially when the brother's gone. So the conflict here is really the sibling conflict. It's the conflict between Avraham and Haran. Haran's not here, so Lot's the stand-in. But if Haran were here, it would have been Avraham and Haran. So Avraham offers what may be the single best solution to family conflict, the single best solution to sibling rivalry in all of Sefer Bereshis. Ki anashim achim anachnu. Twice the Torah goes out of its way to say, we are brothers. And that's why I say not just relatives, but really, right? That's what Avraham is saying. We are brothers. Your father, Lot, was my brother. And I don't want there to be a conflict between us. So maybe the best solution is to separate. But this is the brilliance, right? And there's even a hint to this in the pasuk. Right? If you go left, I will go right. Right? So what's the word? How do you say to go right? Right? Abraham says, "Im hasmol ve'emina." Right? Pasuk tes. If you go left, I will go right. What is the word emina? Right? What does that remind you of? Reminds you of the word emuna, amen. It all comes from the same place, which is faith, trustworthiness. You separate from me, Lot. but you can depend on me, right? I will remain steadfast, right, in our relationship. The fact that we're not proximate, the fact that you're separating from me, in no way diminishes the sense of commitment and the sense of responsibility that inheres in a relationship between two siblings, in a relationship between two brothers. And what Abraham is really saying is, when the chips are down, if ever you should need me, I am your brother. And right, the answer to the question from Perek Daled that Hashem asks Cain, right, where Cain responds and says, Hashomer achi anochi, am I my brother's keeper? Right, we've been waiting for someone to come along and answer yes to that question and be one's brother's keeper. And here Abraham actually does it. You don't need to be right next to me. It's okay. If you have different priorities, if you have different values, you can go your way and I'll go mine. But our relationship is intact. And when you need help, I'll be there. And the proof is in the pudding in the following chapters. When Lot is in trouble and he does need help because there's a war between the 4 kings and the 5, and Lot is taken captive. And taken captive in the ancient Near East means you're either going to be sold into slavery or killed, and you have, that's the end of you. So who swings into action? Abraham. And risking life and limb goes to bat to save his brother's son, his nephew. Ki anashim achim anachnu v'im asmol amina, you go left, I will be at your right side, which is to say, you can always count on me. I will be there if you are ever in trouble and you ever need me to act like a brother. So this is why I say this narrative, right, tells us something not just about Abraham's capacities locally, but also Abraham's contribution to the larger arc of what Sefer Bereshis is about. What I want to conclude with is this final thought, which is that amazingly, right, and this is so underappreciated, Avraham Avinu, we always recognize Abraham as the patriarch and Abraham as the model for fatherhood and patriarchy and what it means to be a father of great nations. Abraham is also the model and the archetype for what it means to be a great brother, not just fatherhood, but brotherhood. And he models it for us so brilliantly in this episode to be able to play his cards right, such that he can remain in communication and in relationship with Lot, even though there's constant tension and conflict. That's the nature of sibling. There's going to be tension and conflict. Does that mean you have to not talk to your sibling? No, it just means that you can find a workable solution, even if you're not exactly in the same place, to be there for one's sibling and one's family in the time of need. That's the greatest testament to one's sense of relationship and one's sense of being a brother. So I will stop here, but happy to stay on and talk further with any questions or comments.